Good afternoon. Welcome. I suspect that this talk is going to piss off about half of you. So I apologize in advance. All I ask is no physical violence, please, but I would love to talk about any of the things I bring up. So I've been thinking for a while. First of all, I was going to say that Amanda came up to me and said, the worst thing you can possibly say to a developer is, it doesn't matter if you overrun. So I hope you brought your sleeping bags. Cool, thank you. All right, so let me talk to you about classes. As you know, Ruby is an OO language. It is OO, it's objects all the way, right? It's one of the first languages that I used where I could say integer dot something and it actually worked. But I want to point out that OO stands for object-oriented. It does not stand for class-oriented. That would be a CO language, and we don't have a CO language because CO is lethal. If you go back to the beginning of OO, Alan Kay and his small talk, I invented the term object-oriented. It wasn't the first OO language, similar probably was, but he still invented the term object-oriented, and I can tell you I did not have C++ in mind. But the reality is that C++ has been the kind of genesis of almost all object orientation going forward. But if we look at Ruby, Ruby is slightly different. Ruby does have some of the C++ idea of classes, but it's not invasive in the way that it is in C++. Because in Ruby, we have objects, and every object has its own state, it has its own behavior, and it encapsulates the two, which is great. That's what we want. But unlike C++, classes are exactly the same. Classes are objects themselves. They're runtime behaviors with one slight difference, and that is a class is also a template which can create objects. It's not the only one, you can write your own, but classes built into Ruby are templates for creating objects. So, this leads me to rule number one of my elimination of the keyword class from Ruby. If what you are writing is not an object factory, then it shouldn't be a class. The only reason you want to write class is if you want something to generate an object. So I went online and I found many, many libraries. I'm not picking this one out, but this is a gem you can get to calculate the checksum on things like credit cards and other kind of government IDs and stuff. So this is a Ruby class. And if you look at it, you'll see that there's not a single instance variable. In fact, there are no instance methods. You can actually look through this. It's all self-dots. And there is no constructor. So, what is the word for a Ruby class that has no instance variables, no instance methods, and no constructor? It's called a... You all passed. It's a module. So why do we write this as a class? It's because class is the first word we go to every single time we open up an editor buffer. I'm going to write some Ruby code, class, now what do I want to do? Right? That's the reflex I need to break you of. So yeah, this is a module. And so that would be perfectly good. In fact, that is plug compatible with that class that we just wrote. But I would go further. First of all, I would do that to get rid of all those self-dots. The reason I would do that, though, is not because I am lazy. Well, it is because I'm lazy. I don't want to write self plus. But it's not really because I'm lazy. It's because if I do that, then I can do something that you couldn't do in the class version. I can mark these as being private because the class version exposed all my little working methods. But now, that private keyword now applies down there, and the outside world cannot call those functions, those methods. So that is a pattern that I use a lot. Rule number 2, if it's named after a design pattern, it's not a class. And yes, you might be thinking that active record is a design pattern. You might think that's being facetious, but it's not. Design patterns were written, the design pattern book was written in the 90s because C++ made it really hard to do things that people wanted to do. And so they came up with workarounds for C++, factories, decorators, all of those kind of things. If you look at Ruby, there are maybe 2 or 3 design patterns that actually are useful in Ruby. All the rest are kind of built into the language. You don't need them. We don't need to code using them. In fact, coding using them gets in the way. So we need to get out of this habit of saying, oh, we're designing better software because we're doing design patterns. We're not. We're making it worse. So whenever you find yourself writing a class that's named after some design pattern, just stop. Abstract base classes is not a class, despite the name, right? An abstract base class has no place in Ruby programming. Why do we have abstract base classes? It comes back to C++ and Java and all these other languages where a class is a compile time construct. So abstract base classes are basically how you get polymorphism into these languages. You define an abstract base class and you derive from it all of the various concrete classes. So it gives you polymorphism, and it gives you guarantees of type safety that these child classes will actually be substitutable for each other. It also gives you the ability to inject methods into your child classes and also make sure that your child classes actually implement other methods. So that's why we have abstract base classes. Now ask yourself, what does that mean for Ruby? Well, we only need the first 3 if our language has strong typing. If we don't have strong typing, who cares? And we only need the last one if our language does not support mix-ins. Because all we're doing is injecting methods into the child classes. So for C++ and Java, yeah, if we're going to do this, we need abstract base classes. For Ruby, no, because as you may have noticed, Ruby is not C++. So for example, class person less than active record base. Say, this is where I'm going to start pissing you off a bit. Active record base is an abstract base class. You can tell that because it has base in the name. Subclassing, which is what this is a form of design where what you're doing is specializing a class. A or B is a subclass of A means that B is an A, but with slight differences. Is a person an active record base? No. Why do we do this? The only reason we do this is because we want to inject methods into our person object. There's no other reason to do it. It's laziness. And it's because DHH had read Martin Fowler's book on the patterns and came up with active record as a great pattern, and he thought, okay, I'll do that. That's how it should have been done, which is kind of how active model does it now. But rather than embedding, I can't remember the last time I counted, it was like 780 methods are injected into a raw active record subclass by that top. 780 methods that you didn't write, that your objects are carrying around with them. Talk about exposure. But here, I can choose what I want to include. I want validation, but I don't want the rest, whatever it might be. So this is, to my mind, a really great way of structuring classes that doesn't use abstract-based classes. If it doesn't have state, there is no reason for it to be a class. Again, from Rails, this is from Once Campfire, or the Embers, as we call it. Classroom is a subclass of application job. And we have a single function in it called perform, and what does it do? It calls another function. Somebody tell me why that's a class. There is no reason on God's green earth why that needs to be a class. All it is a bucket that contains a function called perform. This actually points to a more general issue. Any class that has a function called perform is not a class. There's no state. All it is a function. Get rid of the class. Here's a slightly more convoluted way of causing the same problem, or doing the same problem. And this you see everywhere in Rails. A class that has an initialize function method that will actually set an instance variable, and then another function that uses that instance variable. Oh, you say, that has state. No, it doesn't. Sure, we set state in a constructor, and then we use it down there. But in what way is it different to doing that? In fact, I think that is infinitely better because it expresses intent. Why should I create an object passing in a value that I will then later use immediately in the same call? No reason. Extra code, extra complexity, an object created that then has to be destroyed for no reason. Oh, and obviously you'd use extend self just to get rid of the self dot. Why write 5 characters when you can write 12 or whatever that is? Actually, I do tend to use extend self always. Just for me, that's the little flag that says, this isn't a mixin, this is a namespace. I really, really wish Ruby actually would add a namespace keyword to replace, or as well as module, that had, it's a module that automatically extends itself. But anyway. Another pet peeve with classes. Is your class invalid after you constructed it? And then you have to do something to the object in order to make it valid. If that's the case, it is not a class. This comes from an example, actually, of design patterns in Ruby. It is not the best. So here we have class director. We initialize it by setting some builder instance variable to nil. Immediately, alarm bells start to go off. Then we have an accessor function or a setter function that allows us to set that builder instance variable. Yay! And then we have some instance variables here that then will call functions on that thing that we set it with. So what we're doing is basically indirecting through this so that we can define behaviors on another object. And we were going to... So here is something you see so much, and that is the biggest red flag you can have when it comes to being a class. It's just ridiculous. It's also ridiculous because they have accessor builder at the top there. Why do I have a setter, but whatever? So what should you do? Sorry, that's how you call it right now. Or that's how you could call it if you weren't careful. And what happens if you do that? Blows up. Our object is invalid because it doesn't have a builder. And then if I just call this other method, I've exposed the implementation of our class to the outside world. People that use it have to know that not only do I have to construct it, but then immediately I have to call this setter function. So guess what? It's a module. Not only is it shorter, it's easier to understand. It's in your face. It says, this is what I want to do. I want to abstract away the idea of doing 3 things on an object by calling it build full featured product. Easy. Oop. I appear to have turned it off. There we go. Thank you. I think this might be my last ranty one. Is it a data bucket? Or as the cool kids call them, poros. If it's a data bucket, it ain't a class. This kind of code drives me insane. Think about how many times do you repeat the name of a field here? Not once, not twice, 3 times, sometimes 4 times actually, 4 times. Why? What possible reason do you have, apart from maybe feeling virtuous that you type so much, that you have to do that 4 times? What are the chances that once you might mistype something? In Ruby, that can happen, and nobody will notice until it blows up. You know, if the 3rd instance there you missed the R out of birth, who cares? What is that? It's that. Struct is remarkably underused in Ruby. When you want a data bucket, you want a struct. Or if it's immutable, a data, which is a weird name for it, but that's what they called it. Right? And that gives you all of that. But Dave, you say, I also want to add something to that. I want to add an extra function to it. Like maybe I want to have an agent sessions function for some reason. So it's not quite a poro, it's a poro with just a little bit of smarts. Well, okay, first thing is, you can do that in a struct. You just slap a block on it, and you put your function into it. Should you do that? Maybe. The one time I do that is for 2s, because it's really useful to be able to override 2s for a struct, because then I can make it look pretty. But if it was a function like age in seconds, I probably wouldn't put it in there because I'm kind of falling into the class trap. I'm trying to make it look a little bit like a class by adding instance methods. Instead, what I would do is I would abstract that out into a separate freestanding function in its own namespace, but this isn't here just for show. And I'd have a function called age in second, and I would pass into it anything that happened to have an attribute called date of birth, which in this case could be a person, but it could also be a product or anything else that has a date of birth. Why not exploit the polymorphism you get automatically in Ruby and just make your code more general purpose, easier to test? But if you go that far, I would argue you want to take it one more step and say just age in seconds given a date of birth, and then just pass the date of birth in. That's the most generic version of that function. The code is simpler, it's easier to write, it's way easier to test, and to my mind, it's clearer. So, you are not a class if you don't have instances. If you're not an object factory, you're not a class. If you're an abstract base class, if you're active record base, you're not a class. The worst offender here actually is action controller. When you think about it, what does action controller do? It allows you to respond to HTTP requests at a high level, right? So you have an HTTP request comes in, you send back a response. By definition, HTTP is stateless. There is no state associated at the outside with an HTTP request, apart from cookies, which are a bit of a mess. But anyway, so action controller shouldn't have state, or it shouldn't be embedding state into your functions. It should be way more like Sinatra or most of the other sort of lower small-scale frameworks where all you do is you write a method or a function to handle an incoming request. Because that's it is. It is a function by definition. Input, process, output. No external state. So abstract base classes have no place in Ruby. And as I said, if you've got no state, then you are stateless, and you therefore are not a class. If you're invalid after new, then you don't deserve to exist. And if you are just a data bucket, then you're a struct, or a data, whatever it might be. So why am I standing up here ranting? It's actually José's fault. Because don't look at me like that. I've been programming Ruby for maybe 15 years, ish. When I came across Elixir, and Elixir was the first time I found a functional-ish language that I actually liked. And I started coding, and I discovered I didn't need classes. I didn't need all of the kind of syntactic support that Ruby gives me. In fact, I would argue that things that run on the Beam, that's the virtual machine that Elixir and Erlang and others run on, are actually more object-oriented than almost any other language, because they have a better implementation of objects. They call them processes, but they are so lightweight you can use them just like you would use objects in another language. And so learning that and playing with Elixir and Erlang and that whole ecosystem for a while, I discovered that my Ruby code was just way too bloated. I wasn't writing it well. And I found that the Elixir way of writing stuff with functions transforming state as opposed to functions and state kind of like cohabiting is actually an easier way to write my code. So I started writing code like this. It says 5 years, I'm not too sure. I mean, I was experimenting from like 2016 onwards. But now this is my solid style when I'm writing, actually when I'm writing Ruby, when I'm writing JavaScript/TypeScript, I don't use classes unless I really have to. And the benefits are amazing. First of all, the coupling is cut, I don't know what percentage, remarkably, right? There's so much less coupling because things no longer have to rely on context as much. My methods are way smaller. I'm not 100% sure I know why, I just know that they are. I tend to write a lot of 1 or 2 line methods and then just effectively chain them. I no longer write 1,000, 10,000 line classes. Fat models are a thing of the past because you don't need to bundle all of those methods together if it's not a class. I can have concerns, and each concern can handle a particular portion of what I'm interested in. And they are totally separate modules, totally separate files. So I no longer have to deal with these monolithic, massive, ridiculously hard to work with classes that typically end up with like 30% methods that you never actually call, but you never notice. I get method level polymorphism, just as I showed you on that age thing, age in seconds or whatever it was. Because I've moved my functionality out of classes and into just regular old methods, and because Ruby is polymorphic by design, then I get that on all of my methods. I don't use it that often, but it's really nice to have. And I'm no longer bound by one file for a class. I know you don't have to do it that way, but it's the way everybody does it. I can now split my stuff up totally arbitrarily, and I can make it work the way I want it to work. And because of all of these things, it is way, way, way easier to debug and test. You know what it's like testing a controller or testing a model? You have to set up this incredible context. We have arguments, fixtures versus factories versus mocks versus God knows what, right? All to set up the 107 instance variables that are needed just so I can check that the validation for age is right. I don't need to do that if it's a separate method. I can just call it. It really does make life simpler. So my strong, strong advice is whenever you find yourself writing the word CLASS, stop and say, do I really mean class? Now, if you've been writing Ruby for more than a year, you will say, yes, damn it, I need a class. Fight that, right? This is a habit. This is a bad, dirty little habit that you've picked up. Work out how to stop. Maybe program your autocomplete so that every time you type CLASS, it replaces it with MORON. Find some way of breaking the habit, because I promise you, if you stop writing classes, not all the time, right? They're not evil. They have their place. But if you find yourself not writing classes for 90% of the time you do right now, your code will improve immeasurably. All right, just a couple of things that go along with this that I just wanted to bundle in. When you're developing, don't sit there and create an incredibly complicated directory tree of files and everything else. Just write a file called main.rb and start typing. And don't care about, oh, my controllers have to go. Just stick everything into a file. Start writing code in line. Don't even bother with methods. Just write your code. At some point, you'll notice that you've become uncomfortable because this is too much. At that point, you can refactor into methods. And if you want testing, you can be testing at the same time, and that would be fine. Stay shallow. Don't get nested deep in methods. Don't have these nested deep in classes and modules and everything else. I've seen frameworks where you are actually literally 6 things deep inside nested classes and modules to write a one-line method. Don't do that. Just keep it as simple and as shallow as possible. Down the bottom there, this is the first time, I'm using Quarto for the first time just to try it using for presentations, and clearly its auto-sizing is not quite right. That says, start with hashes. Whenever you feel the need to create a data bucket or a class or anything else, stop yourself and put it into a hash instead. And then maybe later on, you can convert it into whatever you want to use it. But hashes are much underused, all right? They give you what you want, which is a convenient way of grouping data together. The hash is your friend. So this is just like bonus rules I'm going to suggest. The last one is the most important. And that is, while you're doing all this, please, please, please just remember to have fun. Anyway, okay, and now I have to shill. Programming Ruby 4, where's Neil? You around somewhere? There he is, right? This is probably, we haven't actually agreed it yet, so I'm kind of like forcing this on them, but Programming Ruby 4, it'll be out, at least in beta, in December, around about the time that Ruby 4 comes out. And also, just because it's that time of year, 50% off everything at the bookshelf using code SAIL50. No classes. And that's it. Thank you.